Just make sure. Thank you so much, Lee, for the introduction, and thank you, Harold, and all the CCU colleagues for having me here. So I'm honored to be here and talk about the governing of the AI's environmental impact. From two keywords about how do we navigate, the uncertainties, but also how can we shape the future. Some food for thought. And also at the very beginning, I'd like to acknowledge my collaborators, including Jason, Vidal, Riton, and also, of course, Lee, for all the discussion. So maybe we'll go firstly to the context, because when we talk about governance, it's important to look at context. I think that makes sense. For example, if we look into issue like the public trust. So this month and last month, we have seen a lot of reports about, for example, AI data centers related, issues, regarding the public, for example, in Japan, has been concerned about the location of one of the data centers with foreign investment. And the city, for example, made a statement saying that there's some major issues, even it's being no problem or it's lawful, but they're a major issue for the society, for the citizens, but also that issue about, they cannot be adequately addressed with the current rules. So that shows the complexity or the issue we're facing for regulation governance. And now if we go further down the track, is that we see a lot of complexity that is going on. So for example, if we look into that, you see that actually we have on one hand, an urgent need for AI's environmental footprints. Thinking about AI ecosystem, from the downstream, upstream, different data centers, grid system, and so on and so forth. You can name it, which expand. If I think about agentic AI, consumers now can download agentic AI and do the job. So that's much more difficult to do due diligence, for example. And then you're thinking about AI's supply chain, thinking about the equipment, hardware and software. You can think of the life cycle, from where you roll out AI models, training, and so on and so forth to retirement of that. And you see a speeding up the process for that. Thinking about extraction of mineral resources to the e-waste. There's so many, issues we're facing. They are unprecedented. And agentic AI, for example, accelerates of that because you can think about how many increase we can put in 1 second by a human being compared with agents. You have 1,000 agents now, up to you. You have apparent agents. You have the granddaughter, agents. And also another side, we see the urgency because of the explosive use of AI and now it's hard to predict. Another side, we have under-regulation because of the environmental regulation are not designed. It's not designed to fit with agentic AI. We should not blame the legislature at that time. And we see that's kind of the development this time, but also being see how things go. So maybe we look at international one perspective. International environmental law. You have the issue about a precautionary approach, or principle, whether it's been customer international law or not, or the obligation of the environmental impact assessment. But you see the issue that international environmental law already has limits in terms of enforcement. With the AI, they have add an additional layer of complexity, like interpretation of the rules. If you look at regional level, EU AI, as we know that it's been scaled back, in terms of it does have some environmental related clause, but very limited in that regard. And we see that other one like ASEAN, ASEAN Association of Southeast Asian Nations. They have a guide on AI governance and ethics. They are calling for looking to, for example, estimating energy demand, and also looking to whether deployers, but also the developers, their energy consumption. But here, of course, it's being a guide, so it's not, it's not a binding or hard rule in that regard. And at the national level, we see also divergence of position. For obvious reasons, some countries don't really, put a lot of attention in that regard. But also, you see another side, they have country, which are working in other directions. China is one example. Has been called for the compute and electricity coupling, because China also benefit from the green energy generation. But also you see that's more recently asking for data center carbon emission assessment. So they're moving from in the past, the PUE now to the CUE. So you see those kind of ones, starting from 2025. In Singapore is another example. Singapore is obviously bound by the resource constraints, thinking about energy, water, and others. They are already calling for the green data center roadmap, where they are calling for the companies to adopt and green technologies, and then use that technology not only in Singapore but in the region. But more recently, reportedly, they have the proposed Digital Infrastructure Act, where they are considering possible, energy efficient standards for service providers and data centers. So you see a kind of one moving from soft law, possibly going to the hard law perspective. Obviously, for UK, we have many experts here. We'll look into the environmental outcome reports, which are different from the EIA, and as I'm working with League in that regard. So we see that actually the landscape is going in terms of the urgent demand, but also being struggling of the law to deal with that. And obviously, there are other aspects of technology, which that's probably most widely covered in the existing literature. The law, hard to keep pace with the technology development for obvious reasons. Yeah. And if we go further down the track, we're able to see that another kind of the complexity, which is also being based on the paper, which have been from Harold and other colleagues' comments about the digitization and also environment. So we see that actually we have a horizontal governance mismatches, a number of mismatches we can look into. One is horizontal one, you have different regimes. Thinking about AI and environment, it's not only about AI and environment, but also broader issue like investment, even national security, energy security, and so on and so forth. And I will show you later in the next slide. And vertically, we also have the mismatch in terms of governance levels. We already show that at the international level, with the UN, led one, or WEF or other multilateral, institutions, forums able to cover that, all the way to the regional ones, because now it's probably difficult to have international treaty, but can we have those kind of national, regional approach to that? But even for ASEAN, frankly, different countries will have different capacity and priorities in terms of economic development and competitiveness. So you see have an enforcement capacity as well. And local level and national level, there's will be a lot of open questions, including who bears the cost of environment. The data centers will be placed somewhere in the planet or in the space. We're now exploring that, or in the sea. If you want heating up the sea, up to how do you illustrate that? And you see those kind of the people who be close to the data center for noise, for heat, for land occupants, for the property of your value. In some countries, they are in the city center because they're classified data center as office instead of infrastructure. So you see those kind of ones. How do you have the public trust, but also benefits of allocation of benefits and cost, and who bear the cost, who enjoy the benefit. So there's a lot of the issue for governance, but also temporal one, short term, long term one. Rolling out AI in the short term, with the long term, foresight. And obviously, you have the consideration, including how do you deal with the long-term cost, environment damages, which can be irreversible. And to give one of the example, which I work with my colleague, Vincent, and you see that actually as one example here, we see, we have a different kind of cycle. You have the AI, you have investment, you have environmental sustainability. Sorry for being the small fronts, but actually you see that, for example, AI impacts, environment footprint regulation, and that can be fall within all three of that. So it just shows that actually it's not only about environmental issue, but more broadly to environmental and investment issues. Yeah, and obviously you can expand on that, depends on the area of the context, finance, national security and other areas. That shows complexity of this issue because different regulators or stakeholders will work in that regard. Now let's look into the future of this kind of the issue. I think that's one thing we can think about. I was privileged to speak at a bunch of UN events, recently about AI, and you always have the question about, can we learn from lesson, do a best practice? Unfortunately, we don't have airborne solution for that because unprecedented. Even the nuclear system may not be the same with the AI. Think about national, non-national stakeholders. But for environmental, I think international weighting, maybe one of the, areas we can think of, so we should, I'm working with my colleagues, Jason and Yuchen in that regard. For example, for weighting, if you look at the International Weighting Commission, we know that actually there have been, the history where there was some hesitation at an early stage to impose, weighting quotes, in terms of how many Antarctic whales you can harvest. And here you have to see that when you realize at later stage, the weighting stock, is diminishing, and weighting industry is kind of being, back, if you remember correctly, 1970, 1980s, really existed. You see that a lose-lose outcome. If the regulation came too late, you have the problem where you have environmental losses, maybe irreversible, and two, for the weighting industry, you don't have enough whales to maintain your business. So what do we see that similar ones, for AI industry, with the recent, Middle East crisis, we see the energy supply issue, a real one. Same for AI. If we came too late for AI environment, that's not only about the environmental, but also boarding decisions. How much and how long you can make that sustainable. Think about the scale up of the usage, and also the CO2 emission and the CSR, or greenwashing and whatever, contractual and other litigation you may face. So the history we can take is that, we probably cannot afford to be too late. And that would be bad for business, for the government, also for the society. And also we see a lot of enduring challenges, which may not necessarily apply or exist at time of waiting. For example, geoeconomic ones, geoeconomics, the elephant in the room, natural resources, supply. You also think about national security. How do you, because if you have an AI center, you have to keep on operating. So here is how do you have a sustainable energy supply, right? And source of water supply, e-waste processing, disposal as well. And secondly, issue like knowledge gap. Because here is issue, how do you collect the data? Many data center has a non-disclosure agreement, and you have technology and other complexities that you have to navigate through in that regard. And thirdly, also, but not, it's just one example of regulatory capacity. I mentioned about agentic AI, the ecosystems we're facing, we've done a track for quantum computing and others. And how do you build the capacity of regulators to deal with that? Even if, as a regulator, if you use AI in environmental impact assessment, the tool itself carries environmental implications, even for environmental regulators. And to conclude, I think that's actually, it's important to have a holistic approach. I think that's what we can learn from the complexity is that, they cover so many issues, we mentioned earlier about life cycle, supply chain, value chain, ecosystem, different use cases, different content finance, ESG investments, and many more. And a holistic approach is needed for regulation, governance, but also for, social affairs as well. And secondly, we also talk about trade-off. I'm thinking that actually one sustainability measures will be really important, or it's not actually necessarily a cost on the national competitiveness of the technology, because if you look in the long run, you have the issue about resource security, because you cannot afford, as we already seen now, the crisis, energy crisis, and where does you get energy come from, and also you have the issue about how about national security regarding resources. And that's something you need to consider if you use that for solving AI, if you use that for public services or crucial infrastructure and so on and so forth. And also about the future environmental cost. If you have e-waste, if you have warming and pollution and so on and so forth, the cost for recovery that will be very high or can be reversible. So those are the costs should be internalized, and that helps to build a trustworthy AI, because I'm also interested in a trust, which I found to be increasingly important. And thirdly is that, we probably have to see what we can do in practice. A key issue I'm thinking of is that, instead of talk, a key issue is about how do you align incentives. So that is to incentivize the stakeholders, to work together in that regard. And law obviously will play a critical role that require not only sticks. You can think about what we have regulatory tools in the environment and other areas, from EIA, for life cycle assessment, if you look at products, to corporate reporting requirements and many more. Another side, you also have the carrots. The carrots in terms of government procurement, reputation, recognition, even tax reliefs, or something in the middle, where we see those kind of the ESG related or greenwashing related litigations. There'll also be our kind of way where incentivize and internalize the cost to make the businesses and other stakeholders to attach to that. That is also good for their boardroom decisions, in the long term. And also, I would like to highlight that end users, the consumers are a really important one, and because they vote by feed. So how do you educate the consumers and how to raise awareness, but also labeling to differentiate different products will be critically important. We already see what's happening now in recent major AI companies issue in some major countries regarding war-related use of that. The industry is the importance of consumers' role in that regard. To conclude, I think that we're navigating a very complex scenarios, and it's really important to explore governance tools in a creative way because we are facing unprecedented scenarios. But also, it's important to compare notes. So, thank you guys for the opportunity. I look forward to learning more from you. Thank you.